The return did not arrive with celebration. It arrived quietly like a familiar name spoken after a long silence, heavy with everything it refused to explain. Liz's reappearance on Matt's off-road recovery reopened a wound many believed had already scarred over. A wound shaped by absence, speculation, and an audience that never truly stopped watching. For months, her name had lived in comment sections and half-finished theories, dissected by strangers who felt entitled to answers that were never theirs to demand. Behind the cameras, behind the smiles and recoveries pulled from mud and snow, something fragile had broken, and something else had been quietly rebuilding. Her return was not about a job regained or a role restored. It was about survival under a spotlight that never blinks. What does it cost to step back into a place that once felt like home? Knowing the eyes watching you remember the past differently than you do? And when someone returns after being gone, are they reclaiming who they were or proving they are no longer the same? The silence did not arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, frame by frame, until the absence became impossible to ignore. Thumbnails appeared without her face. Episodes rolled forward, missing a presence viewers had unconsciously woven into the rhythm of Matt's off-road recovery. The engine still roared, the rescue still unfolded across dust and snow, but something intimate had gone missing, an emotional texture that could not be named, only felt. Audiences sensed it before they understood it. The way people feel a shift in a room before anyone speaks. Online, the void filled itself. Comment sections became echo chambers of concern, curiosity, and entitlement. Questions multiplied with no answers to contain them. Was it conflict, exhaustion, betrayal, something darker? Each theory chipped away at a real person, turning Lizzy into a symbol rather than a human being. From the outside, the silence felt suspicious. From the inside, it felt necessary. Away from the camera's gaze, Lizzy carried the weight of being discussed without being heard. Her name traveled faster than her truth ever could. She watched fragments of herself circulate online, edited memories, assumptions frozen into certainty, while her own voice remained locked behind a decision she could barely explain, even to herself. The psychological toll was quiet but relentless. Every unspoken word pressed inward. Every rumor another reminder that public belonging often comes at the cost of private boundaries. Nights stretched longer than days. Screens glowed in dark rooms as she scrolled past speculation she knew better than to answer. Silence became both refuge and prison. Speaking felt dangerous. Staying quiet felt safer. In that space, the narrator reveals a deeper fracture forming beneath the surface. Not a sudden break, but stress layered upon stress. Expectations stacked on endurance. The departure had not been impulsive. It had been the final breath after months of holding one too long. The world assumed disappearance meant escape, but inside it felt more like retreating from a storm that never paused. Liz's sense of identity blurred as the role she once filled so naturally began to feel like a performance she could no longer sustain. The boundaries between who she was and who viewers believed her to be dissolved under constant observation. She was no longer just present. She was projected onto, interpreted, owned. Sound faded from her days. Notifications replaced conversations. Silence followed her even into places meant to feel safe. And yet within that quiet, something else stirred. An awareness that staying would have meant losing something more permanent than a position on a channel. The choice to vanish was not about quitting. It was about surviving intact. As weeks passed and explanations never came, the pressure only intensified. Silence, once protective, began to harden into mystery. The audience leaned closer, not realizing how heavy their attention had become, and the question lingered, unresolved and unsettling, hanging over everything that followed. If silence was the only shield left, what kind of damage made silence feel safer than staying? Long before her presence was measured in views and comments, Liz's life unfolded in quieter spaces where strength was learned without recognition. The setting was not dramatic or public, but intimate and formative. Rooms where responsibility arrived early and emotional self-reliance became a necessity rather than a choice. In those years, resilience was not celebrated. It was expected, and so it became invisible. The narrator traces her early world as one shaped by adaptation. Lizzy learned how to read a room before speaking, how to help without being asked, how to carry weight without letting it show. These were not lessons taught deliberately, but absorbed through repetition. The emotional conflict of her childhood was subtle yet profound. The need to be useful in order to belong, to remain steady so others could lean. Over time, that steadiness hardened into identity. She was the reliable one, the calm one, the one who did not ask for space. Silence even then felt familiar. Expressing discomfort seemed unnecessary when endurance brought praise. Needs were quietly folded away, replaced by competence. The psychological pattern formed early. Strength equaled safety, vulnerability equal risk. And though these instincts would later make her invaluable within a fast-growing team, they also planted the seeds of future isolation. As the chapter unfolds, the narrator reveals how those early experiences shaped Liz's emotional reflexes. When pressure mounted, she did not push back. She pushed inward. When expectations grew, she met them without question. She learned to anticipate what others needed before acknowledging what she felt. Over time, the line between self-worth and usefulness blurred until they were nearly indistinguishable. Foreshadowing lingers in every memory. The same traits that would later earn admiration, work ethic, composure, loyalty were quietly eroding her ability to recognize personal limits. She was becoming someone the world could depend on, but someone who struggled to depend on anyone else. Strength became automatic, unexamined, and dangerously unquestioned. Even moments of rest carried a faint tension, as if stillness itself required justification. The narrator describes a young woman who rarely stopped moving long enough to hear her own unease. Emotional needs were not denied. They were postponed indefinitely, and postponement over time became a kind of disappearance long before the public ever noticed. This chapter does not end with crisis, but with warning. The foundation was already laid, the habits already formed. And as Liz's life edged closer to visibility and expectation, the question rose quietly beneath it all, unresolved and unsettling. When strength becomes habit rather than choice, how does one recognize the moment it turns into a trap? The rise did not feel sudden from the outside, but from within it felt relentless. As Matt's off-road recovery expanded, the setting transformed almost imperceptibly from casual recoveries filmed in raw landscapes to a polished operation watched by millions. Cameras lingered longer, episodes carried more weight, and Lizzy, once simply present, became essential. Her voice, her timing, her quiet steadiness began to anchor the chaos of rescues unfolding against cliffs, snowbanks, and desert silence. Yet visibility offered no shelter. The more familiar her presence became to viewers, the less space she felt she occupied as an individual. Recognition arrived wrapped in expectation. Fans spoke her name with affection, but affection carried demands, consistency, availability, emotional labor. The narrator reveals the paradox forming at the center of her experience. To be loved by thousands while feeling increasingly alone in moments that mattered most. On set, the atmosphere hummed with momentum. Engines roared, recovery lines tightened, adrenaline surged. Lizzy moved through it all with practiced calm. Her body language composed, her expressions measured. She knew when to step forward and when to fade back, how to support without overtaking. But behind the scenes, the emotional cost deepened. There was little room to falter when the audience expected reliability, little permission to say no when success depended on cohesion. Praise became a subtle pressure. Compliments hardened into roles she was expected to maintain. The narrator lingers on the psychological tension of being seen but not protected, of performing competence while privately absorbing doubt. Any misstep felt amplified. Any exhaustion felt like weakness she could not afford to display. Silence returned as a coping mechanism. Not because she had nothing to say, but because speaking risked disrupting the fragile balance holding everything together. The team dynamic, once familial, began to shift under the weight of growth. Boundaries blurred as work and identity fused. Liz's sense of belonging grew increasingly conditional, tied not to who she was, but to how well she fulfilled the unspoken version of herself viewers adored. The more she succeeded, the less permission she felt to change. Sound design fades here into a low hum, fans cheering online, notifications chiming late into the night, engines echoing long after filming ends. Sleep becomes shallow. Laughter feels rehearsed. The narrator describes loneliness not as physical isolation, but as emotional invisibility. The feeling of being surrounded yet unseen in one's most fragile moments. Foreshadowing darkens the edges of each scene. The momentum cannot sustain itself forever. Endurance, once a strength, now strains against limits she has never been taught to acknowledge. The pressure does not explode. It compresses, tightening inward, shaping every decision around fear of disappointing others. As the chapter closes, Lizzy stands at the center of success that feels increasingly suffocating. The audience sees confidence. The camera captures composure. But beneath it all, a quiet question takes hold, unresolved and dangerous. When success demands silence, how long can anyone breathe without air? The breaking point did not announce itself with drama. There was no argument captured, no final scene that viewers could rewind and analyze. Instead, it unfolded in private moments that never made it to screen. Early mornings thick with exhaustion, nights stretched thin by racing thoughts. The quiet dread that settled in the chest before another day of performing stability. This was the collapse no one filmed because it happened where cameras could not reach. The narrator draws the setting inward. The world grows smaller. Sound dulls. Even familiar places feel foreign under the weight of emotional fatigue. Lizzy moves through her days on instinct alone. Her body continuing long after her spirit has begun to falter. The same resilience that once protected her now works against her, convincing her she can endure just a little more, push just a little further, ignore the warning signs whispering instead of screaming. Psychologically, fear and guilt intertwine. Fear of stepping away. Guilt at the thought of letting others down. The idea of leaving feels like betrayal not just of the team, but of the version of herself she has spent years becoming. She measures her worth against her usefulness, and every thought of rest feels undeserved. The narrator reveals how burnout often disguises itself as responsibility, how suffering quietly reframes itself as commitment. Moments of isolation deepen. Conversations feel heavier. Words come slower. Lizzy begins to recognize the dangerous thought she has avoided for too long. Staying might cost her more than leaving ever could. Yet even that realization brings no relief. Walking away does not feel like freedom. It feels like failure, like erasing herself from a story she helped build. The chapter lingers on hesitation. Time stretches between decisions. Silence grows louder inside than the noise outside ever was. The absence viewers will later notice begins here not as disappearance but as withdrawal from herself. The narrator describes the physical sensations of emotional overload. Shallow breathing, clenched muscles, a constant low-grade panic that never fully recedes. Eventually, the choice forms not from confidence but necessity. Survival sharpens the edges of decision-making. Leaving becomes less about escape and more about preservation. Lizzy steps back without spectacle, without explanation, because explanations require energy she no longer has. The silence that follows is not meant to provoke curiosity. It is meant to create distance from the things slowly consuming her. From the outside, the absence feels abrupt. From the inside, it feels overdue. Relief and grief coexist uneasily. There is safety in stepping away, but also terror in the unknown that follows. Identity loosens its grip. Without the role, without the structure, she is left alone with questions she has avoided for years. As the chapter closes, the narrator reframes the disappearance entirely. This was not the end of a chapter. It was the rupture that made transformation unavoidable. And yet, one question remains suspended in the darkness she steps into. When someone walks away to save themselves, will the world allow them to return without punishment? The return does not arrive with certainty. It arrives carefully, measured in steps rather than declarations. The setting feels familiar. Dust, engines, open landscapes, but emotionally everything has shifted. Lizzy steps back into view, carrying the weight of absence. Aware that time away does not pause expectation. The world remembers who she was, even as she no longer fully does. The narrator frames her return not as a comeback, but as a confrontation with the past, with perception, with the quiet fear that growth may not be welcomed if it disrupts nostalgia. Every glance feels loaded. Every moment carries the pressure of interpretation. She is watched not just for what she does, but for what her presence might mean. Psychologically, the conflict is subtle yet intense. Lizzy is no longer willing to disappear into endurance. Boundaries, once non-existent, now shape her movements. She speaks less, but with more intention. She listens more to herself than to the noise surrounding her. The narrator reveals the internal recalibration taking place, the careful balancing of visibility and self-preservation. There is no attempt to erase the past. Pain is acknowledged, not dramatized. Absence is treated as part of the story, not a footnote to be ignored. Lizzy does not reclaim her place by pretending nothing happened. She returns carrying the knowledge that survival changed her and that change deserves space. Emotion settles differently now. Where fear once dominated, awareness takes its place. She understands the cost of silence and the danger of total exposure. The narrator reflects on the quiet courage required to re-enter a space that once overwhelmed her. Not to prove strength, but to live honestly within it. Legacy begins to take shape here, not as reputation but as example. Growth is no longer measured by endurance alone, but by the ability to step back without disappearing entirely. Liz's presence becomes quieter, but more grounded, less performative, more human. The chapter closes without final resolution. Some questions remain unanswered. Some viewers will never be satisfied. But as Lizzy stands in the same world that once demanded everything from her, she does so changed, not replaced, not diminished, not fully healed, but aware. And the final question lingers softly without demand. Can visibility and self-worth finally coexist? Or will one always